right, thank you very much for the invitation and to CSID for organizing this conference. I'm going to, my presentation will complement the two excellent presentations we've just heard that focused on the military and the cultural elite in a way, because I'm going to try to focus on the issue of civil society. So I'm going to look more at the ground level, what's been happening in terms of what I see as one of President Sisi's primary objectives during his first 4 years as president was actually to, I think, fundamentally change the nature of state-society relations in Egypt. And if he succeeds in doing this, this would fundamentally alter the nature of the regime. Rigging elections or sham elections, eliminating political rivals, these are things we've seen before in Egypt under Mubarak and also under, in other authoritarian countries in the region and elsewhere in the world. So, rigging elections or eliminating your political rivals, these are not necessarily new strategies in the autocrat's handbook, as we all know. However, I do actually think that what Sisi is trying to do in terms of crushing independent civil society is actually new. Because under Mubarak, we actually saw that, Mubarak allowed NGOs, civil society initiatives, to some extent, even social movements to exist. I mean, they were sometimes harassed, they sometimes were shut down, they sometimes, got arrested. But actually, we saw a proliferation in the number of non-governmental organizations, particularly during the last 10 years of Mubarak's rule. Now, according to the Ministry of Social Solidarity, there are some, over 30,000 NGOs registered in Egypt. Of course, many of those may be, shell organizations, but the point is that there was actually a proliferation of independent groups within civil society that were not under the control of the state. These ranged from, human rights organizations that were very critical of the regime, like the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies or the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights or Nazra for Feminist Studies, but also, cultural initiatives, youth initiatives, charities, etc. Now, one of the things that Sisi has tried to do during his first 4 years in power as president is to make it very difficult for civil societies to exist independent of the government. And this has often been discussed here in the United States as, under the context or the headline of the NGO law. But I would argue that this NGO law, if you read it, it's already very draconian because the actual, law basically says that, NGOs can only operate within the scope of the state's plans. But what I am going to try to convince you of today is that even those organizations that do operate entirely within the scope of the state's plans, that, for example, are only asking for rights that are already in the Egyptian constitution, they are being harassed, imprisoned, arrested, and shut down. So even those organizations that are entirely within the scope of the state's plans, that are entirely constitutional and only asking for their constitutional rights, even they are being harassed and persecuted. Now, I've been teaching at the American University in Cairo since 2008. And over the past year and a half or so, I've been conducting a research project on the crackdown on civil society. And one of the things I wanted to do as a director of this research project was to travel outside Cairo, because a lot of the reporting, that we hear about what happens in Egypt really focuses only on Cairo and perhaps Alexandria. Egypt, of course, is a country of 100 million people. Approximately 80 million of those people do not live in Cairo. And so if we only look at those organizations in Cairo, we really don't understand what's happening elsewhere in the country. So I'm just going to very briefly highlight a few of the findings from this research project, where we traveled from Alexandria in the north to Aswan in the south, Minya, Asyut, Inna, Mahalla, Tanta, Mansoura, to really try to understand what was happening in Egypt, outside of the capital. Now, these articles are going to be published starting next week in early May with the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and there's a sign-up sheet. If you're interested to get those articles, please just sign up, on the sign-up sheet, and you'll receive the email notification. So we're going to be publishing 5 articles. One will focus on the crackdown on women's organizations. One will focus on the crackdown on Coptic Christian associations. One will focus on organizations that work with workers in state-owned companies, privately owned companies, and military-owned companies. Another will be a comparison of Inna and Asyut and comparing the legacies of tribalism and terrorism, because the Gamal Islamiyya was very strong in Asyut in the past, and how this legacy has sort of structured state-society relations in Asyut, compared to Inna. And then finally, an article on the Nubian minority. So I've just prepared a few slides if you would like to, yeah. So just very briefly, just to give you one example of how, the women's movement in Egypt actually, has been it predates the human rights organization, right? So there's been a feminist organization movements in Egypt since the early 20th century. And those organizations range from very radical feminist organizations to sort of reformist organizations to those that are more allied with the regime. But this is just one example of a small women's initiative in Minya that is advocating to uphold the existing laws on underage marriage in Egypt, because Egypt prohibits underage marriage. So this is an organization that is not challenging the regime. Right? They're only asking for Egypt's own laws to be upheld on underage marriage, child marriage, right? But instead of the regime seeing an organization like this as a partner that is actually, in a way, doing its work for them, right? Because, in fact, the government should be upholding these laws on underage marriage or that prohibit child marriage. But they don't. And so you have these civil society organizations that are trying to raise awareness in rural areas regarding child marriage or underage marriage. And so they're not, they're not challenging the government. They're in fact trying to, allow these laws and good governance to be, to spread into rural areas. And yet even organizations like this are being harassed. They're not able to receive funding. They're being accused of receiving foreign funding and being part of a foreign agenda, although again, these are Egypt's own laws, okay? Another article will focus on if you could go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, the Coptic Christian minority. Here is an example of a Coptic Christian association that, for example, promotes understanding between the Coptic Christian minority and the Muslim population. So they're basically trying to combat sectarianism, right? Again, this is not something that is challenging the regime or criticizing the regime, but is actually, you would think, doing something that the regime might appreciate, because they're trying to, essentially promote peaceful coexistence between Copts and Muslims. And yet they too are facing persecution and being not able to do their work, to implement their activities, their neighborhood activities. Can you go to the next slide, please? A third article is going to look at the organizations that work with workers in, as I mentioned, 3 different types of factories. And some of these workers have been merely advocating for existing court decisions to be upheld regarding the payment of their wages or their bonuses. Again, nothing that's actually changed at challenging the regime, just asking for the implementation of a court order regarding the payment of their bonuses. And this is the branch office in Alexandria of the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, which had been helping and promoting awareness amongst working class Egyptians. They had essentially suspended their activities in January 2017 because of this NGO law. Could you go to the next slide, please? And finally, the Nubian minority is going to be the focus of another article. These are images here of the Nuba Association in Aswan, and then the the slide to your right is from Nasr Nuba. Nasr Nuba is a village where Nubians were forcibly displaced at the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, when the Aswan High Dam was built. Now, I made a trip to Aswan and also to this village where they were forcibly displaced at the time of Nasser as part of this research. And one of the things that the new constitution, actually in 2014, has included for the first time is a reference to Nubia. Could you go to the next slide, please? Now, Article 236, again, this is the post-coup constitution, the 2014 constitution, that on paper looks a bit more progressive than the constitution that existed prior to that, right, under Mohamed Morsi and prior to that. So, again, one of the things that was introduced in this constitution was Article 236, which gives Nubians the right to return to some of the land from which they were forcibly displaced at the time of Nasser. So, there was a small and entirely peaceful protest in Aswan on September 3rd of 2017. About 24 Nubians were arrested, they were imprisoned and kept at a facility run by the Central Security Forces in Aswan. One of those people was Gamal Surur, who was the president of the General Nubian Union in France. He's an Egyptian citizen. He has spent time living in France. However, he maintained his Egyptian citizenship. He was known for his philanthropy, for his support of the Nubians, and also for his peaceful advocacy of Nubian rights. After over 2 months in detention, he died of medical neglect. The prison authorities had been refusing to provide him his diabetes medication. He'd fallen into a diabetic coma more than once, and then he died on November 5th. They were all kept in the same prison cell, the 24 detainees, and they were not even given beds to sleep on. So after Mr. Surur died, the other detainees were released. However, they were not acquitted. And so this case has been dragging on since September. It's become so controversial. It's known as the detainees of Dufouf because they were playing a traditional Nubian instrument like a tambourine, a Dufouf instrument, is what it's referred to in Arabic. And they now, a judge recently recused himself. Now, we don't know why he recused himself, of course, but it's possible that he was being put under pressure to issue a verdict, to send them back to prison. I don't know, or something that for some reason he recused himself. And now, instead of investigating the death of Gamal Surur, the state-controlled media launched a media campaign, a defamation campaign against the surviving members of other surviving detainees from this particular case, including the president of the General Nubian Union in Austria. If you could go to the next slide, please. So these were 10 articles published on the same day with the same content on April 1st. This was one day before Sisi was announced that he'd won the elections. One day. So, of course, it seems as if this was timed because of Sisi's re-election and also because of this upcoming court case. So this is an example of Tamer Abdelmonem, who's has a talk show host. He was revealing the secrets of the meddlers, the manipulators, and internationalizing the Nubian issue. I was mentioned in 6 or 7 of those 10 articles because of my research, and that trip that I made to Nasr Nuba, this village, which I just showed you. So clearly, this is it's an attempt to delegitimize these entirely peaceful Nubian human rights defenders by claiming they have contacts to foreigners, such as myself, and also it's an attack on academic freedom. Those of you who've been following Egypt are familiar, I'm sure, with the case of Ahmad Shaheen, who was sentenced to death in a farcical trial. He was a colleague of mine at AUC in 2015. Giulio Regeni was disappeared in 2016 and found in a ditch with signs of torture on his body. So this is worrying that this campaign has been launched now. And in fact, if you could go to the next slide, please. I just have 2 more slides to show you that this is truly a form of incitement. against these Nubian human rights defenders. This is Hamdi Suleiman, the president of the General Nubian Union in Austria. So his picture his picture, his full name are mentioned in these articles in the state-controlled media. And it's truly a form of incitement against them. If you could go to the next slide. This is another example. This is Mohammed Azmi, the former president of the General Nubian Union in Egypt, who was arrested along with Gamal Surur and others. And the next slide. That's it. So as I said, there are about 10 articles published on the same day with the same content, most likely under instructions from security services, intelligence services. As Dalia had mentioned, I did write an op-ed about this. In the Washington Post last week, there are a few copies on the tables, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. The next court date for these Nubian human rights defenders is May 20. Thank you.